Okay, lecture 1.3 is going to wrap up chapter 1, and it is going to deal with talking about sectional anatomy, so looking at body planes, as well as body cavities. So let's get to it. A section is basically the term we use for slicing through any type of three-dimensional object, in this case, the human body or an organ of the human body. And we use this sectioning for imaging purposes, so especially in radiology. There are three main types of radiological techniques that are commonly used. You may have had one or more of these done for something that you had to have a look at. You have an MRI, which involves radio and magnetic waves to view inside the body. You have a PET scan, which uses radioactive tracers to follow along functioning aspects of the body. And then you have a CT or a CAT scan, and that uses X-rays and computers to generate images inside of the body. When you do any of those radiological techniques, you're always going to want to image in different planes. So you're going to want to be able to view those organs or whatever it is you're looking at or for from different vantage points. And so one of the three main sections or planes that you would look at is something called the frontal plane or a frontal section. When talking about any of these planes or sections, you want to know how it divides the body. So into what does it divide the body? For a frontal section, it divides the body into an anterior and a posterior view. And we'll take a look at this and talk through it when we're looking at the actual visual as well. The next type is called a sagittal plane. Sagittal means it's going to divide the body into a left and a right section. So you have a mid-sagittal section or plane if it goes straight down the midline of the body. And then you have parasagittal. So if you were to cut straight down, that nose line, divide the body into a left and right half exactly, that would be called a mid-sagittal. If you were, removing a limb, like an arm, and cutting it right there at the shoulder, that would be a parasagittal section, all right? Or imaging the shoulder for that, you would see that there as well, okay? The last type of plane is called transverse or a cross section, and that means it is going to be viewed horizontally. So you're going to be able to take a look at the organs from a top and a bottom perspective, kind of like if you had a hamburger bun and you were looking up and down from the inside of that hamburger. So let's take a look at that visually. All right, the purple plane is the frontal, so we can divide up sections all along this frontal plane into anterior and posterior sections. Sometimes they do this with the brain, and so it divides it up kind of like slicing a loaf of bread, and you can see different sections of the brain. You have a blue section here that's called the sagittal plane. In this case, it's right down the midline, so we'd call that mid-sagittal, dividing the body into left and right halves. And this is something that you would see again if you wanted to look at parts of organs. We would do this with the brain as well. If we were dissecting, or when we do dissect the brain, we'll separate into right and left hemispheres as well. And then lastly, you have the green plane down here. That's transverse or a cross section, and that's going to give you a view like this. So you're going to be looking at that kind of superior or inferior section of the body, and that is allowing you to see kind of up or down into whatever it is that you are looking at. Lastly, our last topic for chapter 1 is looking at body cavities. So when we get into our body systems, we are going to be looking at them in a variety pack of locations. So we want to make sure that the body cavities, we're familiar with them and the membranes that line them. And so that when we get to those specific organs, we're able to understand where they're coming from. Okay. So a couple reasons why we have body cavities. The first reason is obviously protection. Trauma is very not good for our body parts. And so if we don't have it protected by skeletal system and body cavities and membranes, it will be a not good situation for those organs inside. Secondly, it allows for growth. So there is space for internal organs to grow and develop as that body cavity does as well. So there are two primary body cavities that are the focus of what we'll talk about, and I will mention the other body cavity, even though your text doesn't talk about it. So the first is called the ventral, so that's on the belly side, right, the anterior side. The ventral cavity has two primary, cavities, the thoracic and the abdominopelvic. They are divided by a muscle called the diaphragm, which is a umbrella-shaped thin muscle that helps you breathe. And all of the organs that are located inside of these body cavities are referred to as viscera. Important vocab word, we'll hear it again and again as we look at the membranes that line these cavities. Speaking of that, the main membrane that is involved in lining body cavities is called serosa, or the serous membranes. They release a serous fluid, which basically lubricates in between its two layers, because it is a double layered membrane. So kind of like let me grab this napkin, you have something that folds over. So you have a layer that sits directly on top of the organ, and that's called the visceral serosa. And then it is connected and wraps around to the layer of the serosa that is attached to the actual wall of the body cavity, kind of like wallpaper. And that's called the parietal serosa. And in between, and it's a very, very thin space, I'm exaggerating the distance here, is filled with that serous fluid. And what that allows for, again, is lubrication for movement, reduction in friction, as well as the release of heat, because it is a fluid. So if we take a closer look at the ventral cavity, let's look at the different sections. The first section, or the superior section of the ventral body cavity, is called the thoracic cavity. Within that cavity, there are smaller cavities that contain organs of importance. The first is the pleural cavities, and that will have the pleura membranes in it, and they are surrounding the lungs. When we get to the respiratory system, we'll talk about that in detail. Then you have an area referred to as the mediastinum, and it's broken up into two sections, a section that is superior and the section inferior that holds the heart. We'll talk about that first. That's called your pericardial cavity, or your pericardium. And you have, again, that double layered membrane that is sitting on the heart, but also attaching to the body cavity wall. Above that, you have this section that's referred to as the mediastinum, your trachea, your windpipe, your esophagus, which leads to your stomach, lots of blood vessels that are heading up and back down from your brain, and then an organ called the thymus, which is part of the lymphatic system, one of the places in which T cells are created and mature. All of those membranes within those cavities, the pleura and the pericardium, all those serosal membranes, what they allow for is anchoring. So that when you do a somersault, or you fall off the bed, or you trip and you fall, that your organs don't get all discombobulated and change location. We want them to stay where they belong. We don't want them shifting positions. And that's what the lining, the serosa, allows for. And so here's a view of what we're talking about here. That thoracic cavity that I've already gone through, it's located up here. There's the diaphragm. All right, here's your thoracic cavity containing your pleura, or your pleural cavity, where the lungs sit, and then your pericardium, which is where the heart sits. Inferior to that, which we will talk about next, is the abdominopelvic cavity, and we'll go through the breakdown of these different cavities in there, the peritoneal, the abdominal, and the pelvic. Just while I have the image up, there is another body cavity. It's referred to as the dorsal body cavity, and that consists of your cranial cavity, where your skull is, and then your vertebral cavity, which is your vertebra. So basically, these are two boned structures, so the skull and the vertebral column, that house very sensitive central nervous system tissue. Obviously, the brain up in the cranial cavity and the spinal cord in the vertebral cavity. Just take a look here. This was my napkin example, but your book gives you an example with a balloon, as if you were smushing down a balloon. There is your visceral layer, the layer that sits on the actual organ. And then that folds into a double layer, a second layer that's called the parietal layer, which is the layer that is the wallpaper within the body cavity. So again, creating that anchor to hold the organ in place versus it sloshing around anytime you move, shake, dance, twist, do a cartwheel. And here's just another view of those cavities as well as their membranes. This would be a transverse section, or a cross section. You can see the right lung here, the left lung here. You can see some vertebra, you can see the heart, etc., creating this view. And again, you can see that double layered membrane here. That's your pleural membrane. And then here you can see the pericardial membrane around the heart. All right, heading inferiorly, so below the diaphragm, you have the abdominopelvic cavity that contains your peritoneal, your abdominal, and your pelvic cavities. So the peritoneal cavity is basically a chamber within the abdominopelvic cavity, and it has that double lining serosa that is called peritoneum. And again, you have a parietal and you have a visceral. In the abdominal cavity, it stretches from just inferior to the diaphragm all the way to just superior of your pelvic bones, so that top hip bone, your ilium. Most of your digestive organs are located in the abdominal cavity, such as your stomach and your liver and your intestines, gallbladder, etc. All of those are pretty much located in the abdominal cavity. You also have an area called retroperitoneal space. Retro means to the back, and so in this case, posterior to that peritoneal space between those two membranes. And so what that allows for is all of these organs, like your kidneys and some of the organs of your digestive tract and your pancreas, to be essentially outside of that structure that's located in your abdominal cavity. There's also a section, or you also have the ureters, which are located in there, part of the urinary system. And then the last piece of the abdominal pelvic cavity is the pelvic cavity. That is the most inferior portion, so towards the bottom. It is the section that essentially is in between the pelvic bones. So that's where you're going to have both excretory, urinary organs like your bladder and your rectum. And you're also going to have reproductive organs located there. So depending on male or female, you would have different organs in that body cavity. So as you go through and take a look at the body cavities and some of the plain vocab from today, make sure that you've got the images up while you're going over the terminology so that it is clear for you.